It's quite a strange project, this one, because it came about from a kind of pulp paperback house that approached me and said, would you like to sort of compile this London book? I think thinking that I would just dig up a lot of stuff that was out of print and nice and cheap, and they would whack it together as a simple paperback. And unfortunately, once I started to think about it, I realised it had to be much more interesting than that. You couldn't just perform archaeology, you had to make it a living city. And so I kind of took it sideways into Hamish Hamilton and Penguin, who are my main publishers, and I asked if they'd be interested. But it was going to have to be a much bigger book, because I wanted to approach sort of 40, 50, 60 people and ask them if they could accept this mapping of London that I had, which was that the city we know is really on the point of being threatened or vanishing at the moment because of the grand projects. And you've got a sort of sense of computer-generated realities and virtual realities overwhelming the old historic facts of London. And so if you asked enough people and accumulated enough memories, then I thought the city would remap itself. And naturally, some of them fell into doing fiction, and some of them really wanted to do a documentation on some building or person that had disappeared. And it came in, and it was just a room full of this mound of stuff that I absolutely vanished into. You know, I didn't know how I would ever dig myself out of it. And then bit by bit it started dividing up into zones and areas of the city, that the kind of West End, Soho, the old book trade had a feel to it, and then the East End was all quite melancholy and a sense of erasure, and the Jewish community dissipating and new communities coming in. And I really just went with the flow of it. And I thought what was important at the end of each section was to have a series of short entries, like a kind of gazetteer, some of which would be kosher and some of which would be mythologized by Mike Moorcock, and you wouldn't discriminate between the two states. And so really the nice thing was that in the end the book's writing itself, and it became for me much more like editing a huge film. And the thing became an epic form which had passed beyond anything I could have conceived. And I started to sort of read it myself and feel that I'd written it, even though it may be written by Alan Moore or Stuart Home or anybody else. It all became part of one thing. I used to come up to Abney Park cemetery in Stoke Newington quite a lot, simply because it was a wilderness, so it was somewhere to sort of step off the heat of the street and disappear into this tranquil greenness where you could wander and think. But the thing that always stopped me dead was this particular church, which is in the sort of Gothic style, very, very overgrown with ivy and very covered with graffiti and strange occult signs. And what it looked like to me was a church in one of Samuel Palmer's drawings or engravings. It looked like Shoreham. It had that strange sort of Blakean inheritance sense to it. And then an extraordinary fact I uncovered was that Edward Calvert, who had been a great friend of Samuel Palmer and an associate and apostle of Blake, had actually lived in Hackney. And he'd stepped back from being a figure in the art world in any way and gone into this strange exile in Hackney, and had lived there for the last part of his life, and had died and was buried just up here. So in a sense, this kind of image I'd drawn off this church of belonging to this sort of Blakean tradition and being out there in Shoreham or somewhere was translated into Hackney, and the actual man who'd done these drawings, endless kind of pastoral visions of England, was buried in the wilderness and had to be found. And that took some doing to actually find a grave in this, because numbers and names are all erased and overgrown. And it was exactly the same principle, since we're talking about disappearances and reappearances. For years I'd been obsessed by Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, this kind of fable of Congo. And then I discovered that Conrad himself had lived in Stoke Newington for a time, and when he came back from his own trip to the Congo and his breakdown on the river there and his health gone, he was brought back to the German hospital in Dalston. And so actually all of the notes from which the Heart of Darkness are created are forged there in Hackney. So whatever journey you make, it always brings you back to your own doorstep, and that's the principle that's in this book all the way. My criteria really for getting people into the book was, one, obviously people whose writing I admired and I knew had a particular take on London, people like J.G. Ballard, although his take is of the edge of the city. And he was really reluctant to have anything to do with it because he sort of said, I don't understand the centre of the city, I don't like it, it's gone. And all that he came up with in the end was this little fragment about the Westway, as if it was a Mayan ruin, and the old city didn't matter a damn to him. But then the same thing with people like Will Self responded very strongly because he had a kind of intense notion of what London was, and he'd begun to walk it hugely. And a number of the very obvious people in that way, but then others were much less obvious. They would just be people that maybe got in touch with me about some other thing, like Ruth Valentine wrote to me about the asylums out in Epsom when I was doing the M25 project, and she wanted to follow up a story about someone who'd been in one of those hospitals, so that fitted in. And the old lady Anne Bear, who wrote a story about being stalked by Mervyn Peake. It was just a letter that she sent to me. It wasn't intended for publication. I just asked if I could tell that story because it seemed so pertinent. And the same, her story of this incredible story about being painted by Ludwig Meidner, the German expressionist, and a figure who people didn't know had been in London, a great painter before the First World War. He'd done apocalyptic landscapes and seemed to prophesy the First War. And then, because he was Jewish, he came to London and disappeared. And to keep him going, they give him the commission to paint this young woman. She gets this incredibly rare painting and doesn't like it because it doesn't flatter her, so she destroys it. And all these years later is still kind of tortured by the guilt of this missing thing. But by telling the story, in a sense, it isn't missing. It's kept there, and we can imagine it even stronger than probably if it hung in some gallery now.